I was running through the airport, my bag bouncing against my side and sweat trickling down my neck. I had one thought: don't miss that flight. The first leg had been delayed and now I was playing catch-up. My eyes darted between the signs and my watch, calculating if I could make it to gate B22 before they closed the doors. I rounded a corner, not slowing down, and then bam. I slammed into a wall. No, not a wall, a man. My bag slipped from my shoulder as I stumbled back, barely catching myself before I hit the ground. Shit! I'm sorry, I gasped, reaching out instinctively. No harm done, came a deep voice, tinged with an Irish accent that made me pause. I looked up to see him, a tall guy with striking green eyes and a jawline that could cut glass. His lips curled into a half smile, dimples appearing beneath the stubble on his cheeks. He steadied me with a firm grip on my arm, his touch sending a shock of awareness through me. I should have been watching where I was going, I said, trying to pull myself together, though my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with my flight. What gate? He asked casually. B22, I replied, breathless. He glanced at his boarding pass. You're in luck. That's where I'm headed. Follow me, I know a shortcut. Without waiting for my answer, he turned and started walking, his long strides making me hurry to keep up. I grabbed my bag, adrenaline still pumping, and fell into step beside him. I'm Max, by the way, I said, trying to sound nonchalant, though my pulse was anything but. Liam, he tossed back over his shoulder. We moved through the crowd like we had a mission, because we did. But now my goal had shifted slightly. I wanted to make my flight, sure, but I also found myself wanting to know more about the guy who'd just plowed into my life. We reached the gate just as they were starting to board. I couldn't help but smile in relief. You're a lifesaver. Liam shrugged, flashing another grin that made my stomach flip. Happy to help. Looks like we might be on the same flight. Maybe we'll be seatmates. I nodded, hoping we would be. But as I handed over my boarding pass, I glanced down at his ticket and saw that he was seated a few rows ahead of me, close enough to keep an eye on, but not close enough to talk. As we boarded, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. This was just a random encounter, I told myself. Nothing more. Yet as I took my seat and buckled in, I found myself looking forward to what might happen next. I settled into my seat, the hum of the plane's engines already vibrating through the cabin. I could see Liam a few rows ahead, his dark hair catching the overhead light as he stowed his bag. I couldn't help but watch him, broad shoulders, confident movements. The kind of guy who seemed to own whatever space he occupied. I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. Get a grip, Max. The flight attendants started their safety routine, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying our brief encounter at the gate. I was curious about him more than I should be about someone I'd known for less than 10 minutes. But there was something about Liam, something that felt unfinished, like we'd just begun a conversation that needed to continue. A slight jostle as the plane began to taxi snapped me out of my thoughts. I glanced out the window, trying to focus on anything but the fact that I wished I were sitting next to him, instead of between a snoring businessman and a teenager glued to her phone. As we took off, I felt the familiar rush of ascent, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Liam. A quick glance up the aisle confirmed that he was in his seat, relaxed, flipping through the in-flight magazine. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head slightly and caught my eye. Just for a second, but it was enough to make my heart skip. He smirked, one eyebrow quirking up before he turned back to his magazine. I swallowed, feeling a little too warm for the cool cabin air. What was it about him that got under my skin so quickly? The flight dragged on. I tried to distract myself with the movie, but I couldn't help sneaking glances at Liam. Each time, I'd find him perfectly at ease, occasionally chatting with the flight attendant or gazing out the window. And each time I'd pull my attention back to my screen, reminding myself that this was ridiculous. I didn't even know the guy. But then, halfway through the flight, something unexpected happened. Liam stood up and, instead of heading to the restroom, walked back toward me. My pulse quickened. He stopped by my row, leaning down to speak quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mind if I sit here for a bit? That guy next to me keeps falling asleep on my shoulder. I blinked, caught off guard, but quickly nodded. Yeah, sure, of course. The businessman beside me, mercifully still snoring, didn't stir as Liam slid into the aisle seat. He grinned at me, and I noticed how his eyes crinkled at the corners. Thanks. I needed a break from being a pillow. I chuckled, relaxing a little. No problem. Better company than what I've got here. We started talking, and it was easy, effortless, even. We chatted about the usual stuff at first: work, travel, the nightmare that is airport security. But then, without even realizing it, the conversation deepened. We talked about why we were headed to Chicago, the medical conference we were both attending, and how our paths had almost crossed before at similar events. It was like peeling back layers, each question and answer revealing something new, something intriguing. The connection I'd felt earlier, that unfinished thread, began to weave into something more solid. We laughed over shared frustrations with research, traded stories about colleagues, and found ourselves diving into topics that most people would find boring, but for us were fascinating. At some point, I realized I was leaning in closer, our knees almost touching. Liam was animated, gesturing as he spoke, his accent becoming more pronounced the more excited he got. And I was hanging on every word. Then, just as quickly as it started, our conversation was cut short by the announcement that we'd be landing soon. Liam glanced at his watch and sighed. Guess I should head back to my seat before they start glaring at me. Yeah, I replied, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. Wouldn't want to get on their bad side. He stood up but hesitated for a moment, looking down at me. Maybe we'll catch up after we land. I nodded, trying to play it cool. Yeah, maybe. He smiled, and with that he was gone, making his way back up the aisle. I watched him go, a strange mix of anticipation and unease settling in my chest. There was no denying it now, this wasn't just a random encounter. Something was brewing here, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. The plane landed smoothly, but as we taxied to the gate, I realized that I was already looking forward to seeing him again, wondering what the next twist in this unexpected connection would be. As we deplaned, I tried to shake off the nerves building in my chest. I grabbed my carry-on and joined the slow shuffle of passengers moving through the aisle. I was hyper-aware of Liam a few rows ahead, his broad back just visible between the other travelers. I couldn't decide if I wanted to catch up to him or keep my distance. Was it too much to hope that this wasn't just a one-off conversation? I finally made it off the plane and into the terminal, the usual chaos of an airport greeting me, families reuniting, business travelers hurrying by, and a steady stream of announcements crackling overhead. I scanned the crowd instinctively, even though I told myself it was ridiculous. I didn't know where he was headed, and I couldn't just hang around looking for him. But then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. Max, wait up. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. There he was, weaving through the crowd toward me, his face breaking into that easy grin when he saw I'd heard him. Relief flooded through me, and I found myself smiling back before I could stop it. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't been hoping he'd find me. Didn't think I'd see you again. Liam caught up to me, slightly out of breath, but still looking annoyingly composed. I thought the same, but here we are, he paused, then added, so how long's your layover? Actually, this is my final stop, I said. I'm here for a conference. His eyes lit up. No kidding, me too. What are the odds? We fell into step together, heading toward baggage claim. The flow of people around us pushed us closer, our shoulders occasionally brushing. It felt natural, like we'd known each other longer than just a couple of hours. The conversation picked up right where we'd left off on the plane, and before I knew it, we were laughing like old friends. As we waited for our bags, I learned that we were attending the same medical research conference, just in different tracks. He was presenting some of his latest work in virology, while I was there for immunology. Our fields overlapped more than I would have thought, and the more we talked, the more I realized just how much we had in common beyond just work. When our bags finally arrived, it turned out we were even staying at the same hotel. I raised an eyebrow at that. You sure you're not stalking me? He laughed, shaking his head. If I was, I'd be doing a pretty terrible job of it, seeing as I just met you. Fair point. We grabbed our luggage and headed for the exit. Outside, the cold Chicago air hit us like a wall. I zipped up my jacket, shivering slightly. Liam didn't seem to notice the chill as much, but then again he had that warm, confident aura about him that seemed to defy the weather. We shared a cab, chatting the whole way into the city. The drive was a blur of conversation and city lights flashing by. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so comfortable around someone so quickly. There was something easy about Liam. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, even in the back of a crowded cab. When we finally pulled up to the hotel, we discovered that our rooms were on the same floor, just a few doors apart. Liam looked over at me as we stood in the elevator, the silence suddenly charged with something unspoken. "Maybe we can grab dinner later," he suggested as the doors opened. "Check out the hotel restaurant, or maybe find a place nearby." I nodded, trying to keep my excitement in check. "Sounds good. How about 7? "Perfect," he said, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer before he stepped out of the elevator. "See you then, Max?" "Yeah, see you," I replied, watching him walk down the hall to his room. As I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I realized I'd been holding my breath. This was happening, whatever this was. I tossed my bag onto the bed, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process the last few hours. Liam was different from anyone I'd met in a long time, and part of me was nervous about what might come next. But another part of me, the part that was tired of playing it safe, was ready to find out. I spent the next hour pacing around my hotel room, trying to shake off the nervous energy that had taken hold. It was just dinner, I kept telling myself. But the truth was, it felt like more than that. I changed my outfit twice before finally settling on dark jeans and a blue button-down that I hoped made my eyes look a little brighter. I glanced at the clock. 6:45. Time to head down. I grabbed my key card and made my way to the elevator, my heart thudding a little harder with each floor I descended. When the doors opened to the lobby, I spotted Liam right away. He was leaning against a pillar, looking effortlessly put together in black slacks and a forest green sweater that hugged his frame in all the right places. He looked up as I approached, and the smile that spread across his face sent a warm rush through me. "Hey, you're early," he said, pushing off the pillar and straightening up. "Could say the same about you," I replied, hoping the slight tremor in my voice wasn't noticeable. He chuckled. "Guess we were both looking forward to this." "Yeah," I admitted, "I guess we were." We headed to the hotel's upscale steakhouse, making small talk about the conference schedule for the next day. But as soon as we were seated and our drinks arrived, the conversation shifted back to more personal topics: our lives, our interests, the things that got us excited about our work. It felt natural, easy, like we'd known each other longer than just a day. Liam's eyes sparkled as he talked about his work in virology, his passion for discovering new ways to combat emerging viruses. I found myself getting lost in his words, captivated by the intensity with which he spoke. And when he asked me about my own research, I was surprised at how easily the words flowed. He listened intently, nodding and asking questions that showed he genuinely cared about what I had to say. Our steaks arrived, perfectly cooked, but the food was almost an afterthought. We were too wrapped up in our conversation, too caught up in the connection that seemed to be growing between us with every passing minute. The restaurant around us faded into the background, the clinking of glasses and soft murmur of other diners becoming nothing more than a distant hum. At one point, Liam leaned in, his voice dropping slightly as he shared a story about a disaster of an experiment that had ended with a lab full of contaminated samples. His frustration was clear, but there was also a glimmer of humor in his eyes that told me he could laugh about it now. I found myself leaning in too, drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Sounds like you've had your fair share of challenges," I said, trying to keep the conversation light, even as my heart pounded in my chest. "Haven't we all?" he replied with a wry smile. "But that's part of the job, right? You keep pushing forward, even when it feels like everything's against you." There was something in the way he said it, something that hinted at a deeper struggle, but he didn't elaborate. I could have pressed for more, asked him what he meant, but instead I let it hang in the air between us. Maybe it was better not to pry, not to push too hard, too soon. The conversation flowed on, touching on music, movies, and the little quirks of life that made us both laugh. But underneath it all, there was an undercurrent of something more, something that neither of us had said out loud, but was becoming impossible to ignore. As dinner wound down and we sipped the last of our drinks, Liam glanced at his watch. "It's still early," he said, his tone casual, but there was a spark in his eyes. "Want to keep this going? Maybe grab a nightcap?" I hesitated, just for a moment, but I knew what I wanted. "Sure," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as he did. "Why not?" We stood up, and for a second, there was a charged silence between us. I could feel the weight of the decision we were both about to make, but instead of shying away from it, I found myself looking forward to what might come next. We left the restaurant and headed back toward the elevator, our footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The ride up to our floor was a blur. I was hyper-aware of Liam standing next to me, the warmth of his presence just inches away. When the doors opened, we stepped out into the empty hallway, and he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. So he said, his voice low, "My place or yours?" My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay cool. "Yours is closer." He grinned, a slow, knowing smile that made my pulse quicken. "Good choice." And just like that, the tension that had been building between us all night snapped, and we both moved at once. He grabbed my hand, pulling me toward his room, and I followed without hesitation, anticipation, and excitement swirling together in a heady rush. Whatever was going to happen next, I was all in. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly the air in Liam's hotel room felt charged, electric. He let go of my hand, and for a moment we just stood there, taking each other in. The room was dimly lit, the city lights filtering through the curtains, casting a soft glow that made everything feel more intimate. Liam moved first, stepping closer, his eyes locked on mine. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He reached out, his hand brushing against my jaw, his thumb tracing a line down to my chin. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "I've been thinking about this all night," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "So have I admitted, my breath hitching as his hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or slow, it was intense, hungry, like he'd been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. His lips moved against mine, demanding, and I responded in kind, letting myself get lost in the heat of it. The world outside that room ceased to exist, it was just the two of us, a tangle of need and desire. Liam's hands were everywhere, tangling in my hair, sliding down my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My own hands weren't idle either, exploring the hard lines of his body, feeling the strength and warmth beneath his clothes. Every touch, every kiss only fueled the fire burning between us, making it impossible to think about anything other than the feel of his skin against mine. Clothes were shed in a flurry, dropped carelessly to the floor as we moved toward the bed, our mouths never breaking contact. By the time we reached it, we were both breathless, but there was no stopping now. We fell onto the bed, limbs tangling, the mattress dipping under our weight. Liam was above me, his green eyes dark with desire, his breath coming in ragged pants. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. In response, I pulled him down for another kiss, deeper this time, pouring all the pent-up emotion into it. I'm sure I whispered against his lips. That was all the confirmation he needed. The next moments blurred together in a rush of sensation, heat, pressure, the sound of our breathing mingling with the quiet rustle of sheets. Everything felt heightened, more intense than anything I'd experienced in a long time. Liam was relentless, his touch sending sparks of pleasure through me, making it impossible to think, only to feel. Time lost all meaning as we moved together, driven by a need that seemed to have been building from the moment we first collided in that airport. There was no room for doubt or hesitation, only the raw, unfiltered connection that had sparked between us and now blazed uncontrollably. When it was over, we lay there in the aftermath, our breaths slowly evening out, the heat of the moment giving way to a warm, satisfied glow. Liam's arm was draped over me, his body still pressed close, and for a while neither of us spoke, the silence comfortable, filled with a sense of shared contentment. But even in that moment of calm, I felt the weight of what had just happened settle over me. This wasn't just a random hookup, something to be forgotten the next day. There was more to this, more to Liam, to what we just shared, and I knew that whatever came next would change things between us, one way or another. Liam shifted beside me, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at me. His expression was softer now, the intensity from before replaced by something I couldn't quite place. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Yeah, more than okay." He returned the smile, leaning down to press a quick, almost tender kiss to my forehead. "Good." We lay there for a while longer, the city outside humming quietly, the sounds of the night filtering in through the window. There was no rush, no urgency, just the two of us, soaking in the moment. Eventually, Liam spoke again, his voice hesitant, as if he were still figuring out the words. This ... whatever this is, he began. It doesn't have to end tonight. I looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or regret, but found none. I'd like that, I replied, meaning it. Me too, he sighed, the tension leaving his body as he settled back down beside me. Guess we'll just have to see where it goes. I nodded, feeling a sense of quiet determination settle over me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I wasn't ready to let this go. Not yet. We drifted off to sleep like that, wrapped up in each other with the unspoken promise of more to come lingering in the air. I woke up to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the curtains and the unfamiliar, comforting warmth of another body beside me. For a moment I stayed still, my eyes closed, savoring the sensation of being wrapped in the sheets with Liam's arm draped over my waist. The events of the night before replayed in my mind, each memory as vivid as if it were happening all over again. I opened my eyes and turned slightly, careful not to wake him. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even, his face relaxed in the quiet of the morning. The sight of him lying there, so close, so real, stirred something inside me, a mix of contentment and a gnawing sense of uncertainty about what would come next. Liam shifted, his arm tightening around me briefly before he blinked his eyes open. He smiled when he saw me awake, and for a moment, the uncertainty faded, replaced by the simple pleasure of being in this moment with him. Morning, he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Morning, I replied, my own voice still a little groggy. For a few minutes we just lay there, enjoying the lazy warmth of the early morning. It was nice, comfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the storm. What did last night mean? Was this just a one-time thing, or was there something more between us? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't know how to ask them without sounding desperate or needy. Liam seemed to sense my hesitation. He pushed himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with a mix of curiosity and something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. You okay? Yeah, I said quickly, offering him a small smile, just ... thinking. About his tone was gentle, but I could tell he wanted to know where my head was at. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. About what happens next. Last night was ... unexpected. Good, but unexpected. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, it was. But I don't think it has to be a one-off, if that's what you're worried about. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I wasn't sure where we stood. Liam's smile was reassuring. I like you, Max. I'm not the type to say that if I don't mean it. Last night wasn't just about ... well, you know. There's something here, and I'd like to see where it goes. Relief washed over me, along with a surge of something else, hope maybe. I'd like that too. Good, he said, leaning down to press a brief, tender kiss to my lips. Because I was worried I might have scared you off. I laughed softly. Not even close. We stayed like that for a while, talking quietly about nothing and everything. It was easy the way conversation flowed between us, as if we'd known each other for much longer than just a day. But even as we talked, the reality of the day ahead started to creep in. The conference, the presentations, the fact that we were both here for work, not for whatever this was turning into. Eventually, Liam sighed and glanced at the clock. We should probably get up. Don't want to be late for the conference. Right, I agreed, though part of me wanted to stay in bed with him, to hold on to this bubble of intimacy for just a little longer, but reality was calling and we couldn't ignore it forever. We reluctantly disentangled ourselves from the sheets and got dressed, the easy banter from earlier giving way to a more comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward, just ... quiet, like we were both thinking about what came next. Liam grabbed his wallet and room key, then turned to me, his expression serious. How about we meet up after the sessions today? Grab dinner again, maybe. I smiled, feeling that same sense of anticipation from the night before. I'd like that. Let's make it a plan. Great, he said, his smile returning as he opened the door. I'll see you later then. See you, I echoed, watching him leave before closing the door behind him. I leaned back against the door for a moment, my mind still racing. Last night had been incredible, but now, in the daylight, I had to face the fact that this wasn't just a casual fling. There was something real here, something that could be complicated and messy, especially with us both being in the same field. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to take that risk. Whatever happened next, I wanted to see where this thing with Liam could go, and that thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I pushed off the door, grabbing my own things and heading out to start the day. Whatever the future held, I had a feeling it was going to be anything but boring. The conference was in full swing by the time I arrived at the convention center. The halls buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and nerves, attendees milling about with name badges and coffee cups in hand. I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see Liam among the crowd, even though I knew our paths might not cross until later. Still, the thought of seeing him again kept a low hum of anticipation running through me all morning. My first session was a panel on the latest advances in immunotherapy, a topic that normally would have had me fully engaged, but today I found it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the way Liam had looked at me, the feel of his hand on mine. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I was here for work, not for whatever this was turning into. After the session ended, I grabbed a quick coffee and checked my phone, hoping for a message from Liam. Nothing yet, but that was fine. We were both busy, and it wasn't like we'd made any specific plans to meet during the day. Still, I couldn't help the slight pang of disappointment as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I decided to head to one of the smaller breakout sessions. As I approached the room, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd, one I hadn't expected to see today. Max. I turned to see Sarah, a colleague from a lab I'd collaborated with a couple of years ago. We'd kept in touch, but it had been a while since we'd actually seen each other in person. Sarah. Hey, I greeted her with a smile, genuinely happy to see her. We exchanged a quick hug, the kind that's more habit than anything else. I didn't know you were attending this conference, she said, her eyes bright with surprise. Yeah, kind of a last-minute decision, I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. What about you? Same here, she said. I'm presenting in one of the virology tracks this afternoon. Virology. My thoughts instantly went to Liam. Virology, huh? Do you know if Liam Donovan is speaking today? Sarah's eyebrows shot up. Liam? Yeah, actually I do. He's got a big presentation right after lunch. How do you know him? I hesitated, trying to find the right words. We met on the flight over, just hit it off, I guess. She gave me a knowing smile, the kind that made me wonder just how transparent I was being. Well, Liam's a great guy. We've crossed paths at a few conferences before. Smart, dedicated, and if you're lucky, he might even show you that wicked sense of humor he hides so well. I chuckled, though her words left me feeling a bit uneasy. How well did I really know Liam? And how much of what I felt was just the heat of the moment, clouding my judgment? Before I could dwell on it, Sarah continued. If you're free later, we should catch up properly. Maybe grab a drink after the sessions. Yeah, that sounds great, I agreed, though my mind was still partially elsewhere. I'll text you later. We said our goodbyes and I headed into the breakout session. The room was small, more intimate than the large panels, and I found a seat near the back, trying to refocus on the reason I was here. The presentation was engaging, but as the speaker droned on, I couldn't stop my thoughts from drifting back to Liam, and now, to what Sarah had said. After the session, I stepped out into the hallway, my phone buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Liam's name on the screen. Liam free for lunch? I smiled, quickly typing out a reply. Max, absolutely. Where should we meet? Liam, there's a cafe in the atrium. See you in 10? Max, see you there. I headed toward the atrium, my earlier worries fading as excitement took over. I spotted Liam almost immediately. He was hard to miss, standing tall among the crowd, scanning the room. When our eyes met, he smiled, and just like that, the morning's unease melted away. Hey, he greeted me as I walked up. You look like you could use a break. You have no idea, I replied with a laugh. This morning's been a whirlwind. Tell me about it, he said, leading me to a small table in the corner of the cafe. We ordered quickly, both of us opting for something light, the kind of lunch you have when your mind is on 1,000 other things. So how's your day been, I asked once we were seated, hoping to keep the conversation going. Busy, Liam said, though his tone was lighter than before. But good. It's always a bit of a rush before a big presentation. "Yeah, I heard you've got one this afternoon," I said, not wanting to mention how I'd found that out, feeling ready. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, flashing a grin that made my stomach flutter. "But it's good to take a break and clear my head a bit. How about you, surviving the conference madness?" "Barely," I admitted. "But this is helping." He raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "Lunch with me is helping." I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't help but smile. "Yeah, something like that." The conversation flowed easily as we ate, touching on the usual topics: work, the conference, random observations about the people around us. But as we talked, there was an unspoken tension between us, the same spark that had been there the night before, still simmering just beneath the surface. After we finished, Liam glanced at his watch. "I've got to head out soon, but how about we meet up again after the sessions today? Dinner, maybe." I nodded, trying to keep my tone casual. "Sounds good to me." He smiled, and for a moment I could see the same anticipation in his eyes that I was feeling. "Great, I'll see you later then." We stood up, and as we walked out of the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. This wasn't just a casual lunch, and whatever we had started last night wasn't going away anytime soon. But as much as that excited me, it also left me with a sense of uncertainty, a feeling that the path we were on was about to get a lot more complicated. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the day would bring and whether we were both ready for it. The rest of the afternoon dragged by in a haze of presentations and panel discussions. Normally, I'd be fully engaged, taking notes and thinking about how the latest research could tie into my own work. But today, my mind kept wandering back to Liam and our upcoming dinner. I was looking forward to it, yes, but there was also that nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite shake. After my last session of the day, I made my way to the main hall where Liam's presentation was taking place. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, maybe reassurance that the connection I felt with him wasn't just in my head, that we were on the same page. But as I slipped into the back of the crowded room and took a seat, I realized this was also a chance to see him in a different light, to understand more about the person I was so drawn to. Liam was already speaking by the time I arrived, standing at the front of the room with the kind of confidence that commanded attention. His voice was clear and steady, his accent lending an air of authority to his words. The presentation was about his latest work on emerging viruses, and as he spoke it became clear just how passionate he was about his field. He moved through the slides effortlessly, explaining complex concepts with a precision that made them accessible even to those outside his specialty. The room was captivated, myself included, and for a moment I felt a swell of pride in him, in what he was doing, in the fact that I'd been lucky enough to get to know this side of him. But then something happened that caught me off guard. Liam finished a particularly compelling point, and a hand shot up in the audience. The man who spoke was older, with the kind of gravitas that suggested he was a big deal in the field. His question was sharp, pointed clearly a challenge to Liam's findings. "How do you reconcile this with the latest data from the CDC?" the man asked, his tone challenging. There was a brief, tense silence. All eyes turned to Liam, waiting to see how he'd respond. For a split second, I saw something flicker in Liam's eyes, something like doubt. But then it was gone, replaced by the confident, assured expression he'd worn throughout the presentation. "The data from the CDC is crucial," Liam replied, his tone measured, but our findings suggest that there's more to the story. The virus we're studying shows a different pattern of mutation, one that could explain the discrepancies. We're still analyzing the results. But early indications are that this could lead to a breakthrough in understanding how these viruses evolve. The man seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly, as if conceding the point. But the exchange left me feeling uneasy. Liam had handled it well, too well, maybe. The smoothness of his response, the way he'd deflected the challenge without really answering it, left me with a sense of something unresolved. As the session ended and the audience began to disperse, I stayed seated, watching Liam gather his notes. People approached him, congratulating him on a job well done, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on beneath the surface, something he wasn't telling me. Finally, Liam caught sight of me and made his way over, a smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey," he greeted me, his voice casual, "glad you could make it." You were great up there, I said, meaning it, but my mind was still turning over what I'd just witnessed. Thanks, he replied, though there was a slight edge to his tone like he was bracing himself for something. You ready to head out? Yeah, sure, I said, standing up and trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. We walked out of the room together, falling into step side by side, but the easy conversation from earlier had been replaced by a more subdued silence. As we made our way out of the convention center, I glanced over at him, trying to gauge his mood. So that question back there. It seemed pretty intense. Liam shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. It's all part of the job. You have to be ready to defend your work, especially when you're dealing with something as controversial as virus mutations. True, I said slowly, not entirely convinced, but you handled it well. Thanks, he said again, though there was a note of finality in his voice that told me he didn't want to talk about it anymore. We continued in silence until we reached the street outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and the city was alive with the sounds of traffic and people heading home. Liam stopped, turning to face me, and for a moment I thought I saw that flicker of doubt in his eyes again. Look, he began, his voice softer now. I know this might seem complicated, and I get it if you're having second thoughts. I blinked, surprised by his sudden vulnerability. Second thoughts? About what? About this, he said, gesturing between us. I like you, Max. I really do. But I know how this might look, two people in the same field, both at a conference hooking up. It's not exactly uncomplicated. I shook my head, reaching out to touch his arm. Liam, I'm not worried about that. But I do think there's something you're not telling me. He tensed under my touch, and I could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between wanting to open up and the instinct to keep things close to the chest. There's a lot about my work that's sensitive. Things I can't really talk about, not yet. I nodded, understanding but still feeling that nagging doubt. I get that, I do. But if we're going to see where this goes, I need to know that we're being honest with each other. He looked down, his jaw tightening, and for a moment, I thought he might just brush it off. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're right. I'm sorry. It's just complicated. I squeezed his arm gently, trying to offer reassurance. I'm not asking for all the answers right now. Just don't shut me out, okay? Liam met my gaze, and something in his expression softened. Okay, he said quietly, I won't. We stood there for a moment longer, the city bustling around us, and I felt the tension between us ease just a little. Whatever had happened in that presentation, whatever doubts or fears he was holding on to, I knew we'd have to face them together if this was going to work. Let's grab that dinner, I said finally, offering him a smile. We'll figure this out. Liam nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. Yeah, let's do that. We turned and headed down the street, side by side, both of us aware that the road ahead wasn't going to be simple. But for now, at least, we were in it together. And that was enough. We walked in comfortable silence, the bustling city around us a sharp contrast to the quiet tension that hung between us. Liam led the way to a small, tucked-away restaurant. The kind of place you'd only know about if you were a local. The cozy, dimly lit atmosphere inside was a welcome escape from the noise of the city. It felt intimate, almost too intimate given the unresolved tension still lingering between us. We were seated at a corner table, the soft glow of a candle flickering between us. The waiter handed us menus, but I found it hard to focus on the words. My mind was still churning with questions, doubts, and the lingering sense that Liam was holding something back. I glanced up at him, hoping to catch some sign of what he was thinking, but his expression was unreadable. So Liam said after a moment, breaking the silence, "What do you recommend? I'm not too familiar with the menu here." I glanced down at the menu, forcing myself to concentrate. "I've heard their steak is good," I replied, though my voice lacked the enthusiasm I was aiming for. "But honestly, everything looks great." He nodded, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the edge of the table. It was clear that neither of us was really focused on the food. "Liam," I began, deciding to cut to the chase. "We need to talk." He looked up, meeting my gaze with a resigned expression, as if he'd been expecting this. "Yeah, we do." The waiter returned just then, and we both hastily ordered, choosing quickly without much thought. As soon as he walked away, the air between us grew heavy again, thick with the words we hadn't yet spoken. About earlier I started, keeping my voice low but steady. That question during your presentation, it rattled you. And I get it, work is work, and there are things you can't talk about. But I need to know where we stand, Liam. I need to know if I can trust what's happening between us. Liam exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, as if he were gathering his thoughts. You're right, he said finally. That question did rattle me. It's not because I don't believe in my work, it's because I know there's more at stake here than just my reputation. I frowned, trying to piece together what he was saying. What do you mean? He hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if weighing how much to reveal. There are some things I'm working on that aren't just about the science. They have implications, things that could affect a lot of people if they're not handled right. I felt a chill run through me at his words, the gravity of what he was saying beginning to sink in. Are you in some kind of trouble? Liam shook his head quickly. No, nothing like that. It's just. There are ethical questions, political ones even. I'm navigating a minefield, and one wrong move could set off something much bigger than just a failed experiment. His words hung in the air, and I could see the strain in his expression, the weight he was carrying. Suddenly it all made sense, the guardedness, the deflection during his presentation, the tension that had been building between us. I didn't realize it was that serious, I said quietly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Liam squeezed my hand, his grip firm but warm. It is. And that's why I've been hesitant to get too close, Max. Not because I don't want to, I do. But because I don't want to drag you into something that could get messy. I met his gaze, feeling the sincerity in his words. Liam, I appreciate that. But I'm here because I want to be. I knew this wasn't going to be simple from the start, but I'm willing to take the risk if you are. His eyes softened, and for the first time since we sat down, I saw a hint of relief in his expression. I am. I just didn't want to put that pressure on you. I'm not asking for all the answers right now, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken earlier. But I do need honesty. If we're going to figure this out, we need to trust each other. Liam nodded, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. You're right. I'm sorry for not being upfront with you sooner. I didn't want to scare you off. I smiled, feeling the tension between us begin to ease. It takes more than that to scare me, Liam. The waiter returned with our food, and we let go of each other's hands to make room on the table. The scent of the dishes wafted up, reminding us both that we hadn't eaten since lunch. As we started to dig in, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, our favorite travel destinations, funny stories from past conferences, little things that made us laugh. But even as we talked and ate, the underlying current of what we just discussed remained. There was something real between us, something worth fighting for, but it wasn't going to be easy. The complications of our professional lives, the secrets Liam was keeping, and the growing feelings we both had were all intertwined in a way that couldn't be ignored. After we finished dinner, we lingered at the table, neither of us in a hurry to leave. The conversation flowed more naturally now, the earlier tension replaced by a mutual understanding. We were both aware of the challenges ahead, but for the first time it felt like we were on the same page, ready to face whatever came next together. When we finally decided to leave, Liam walked me back to the hotel, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. The city lights glittered around us, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but I felt a sense of calm I hadn't expected. Whatever the future held, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. As we reached the hotel entrance, Liam paused, turning to face me. So, tomorrow. Tomorrow, I confirmed, feeling a warmth spread through me at the thought. We'll take it one step at a time. He leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a soft, lingering kiss that sent a pleasant shiver down my spine. When he pulled back, there was a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability that made my heart ache in the best way. Good night, Max, he whispered, his voice low and warm. Good night, Liam, I replied, watching as he turned and headed down the hall to his room. I stood there for a moment, absorbing everything that had happened, before finally heading up to my own room. As I lay down in bed, the events of the day replayed in my mind, and for the first time I felt like we were moving in the right direction together, despite the uncertainties and challenges ahead. The next morning I woke up feeling more centered than I had in days. The uncertainty from the previous evening had shifted into a quiet resolve. I was ready to see where this thing with Liam could go, no matter how complicated it might get. After getting ready, I headed down to the hotel lobby to meet him for breakfast before the final day of the conference. Liam was already there when I arrived, sipping coffee and flipping through the conference schedule. He looked up as I approached, a warm smile spreading across his face. Morning, he greeted me, his voice soft but filled with a warmth that sent a pleasant tingle down my spine. Morning, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. The air between us was lighter, easier, the tension from last night seemingly resolved. We ordered breakfast, and as we ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Talk of the day's upcoming sessions, future plans, and little anecdotes from our lives that we hadn't yet shared. But just as we were finishing up, Liam's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting in an instant from relaxed to tense. "Everything okay?" I asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. Liam hesitated, his fingers tightening around the phone. I need to take this. I'm sorry, it won't be long." He stood up quickly and stepped away from the table, his voice low as he spoke into the phone. I watched him pace near the entrance of the restaurant, the way his posture grew more rigid with each passing moment. Whatever the call was about, it was serious. A few minutes later he returned, his face set in a troubled frown. He sat down, but the lightness from earlier was gone, replaced by a tension that had me on edge. "Liam," I prompted gently, trying to read his expression. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to drag you into this, but there's something I need to take care of, something that can't wait." "Is it related to your work?" I asked, my concern growing. He nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, and it's complicated. There are some developments I wasn't expecting, and I need to handle them now." "Do you need help?" The offer was out of my mouth before I could think it through, but I meant it. Whatever he was dealing with, I didn't want him to face it alone. Liam shook his head, though his expression softened slightly at my offer. "I appreciate that, Max, but this is something I have to do on my own. It's too risky to involve anyone else." The gravity in his voice sent a chill through me, but I nodded, understanding that this was part of the complications he'd warned me about. "Okay, but if you need anything, you can call me." "I will," he promised, reaching across the table to take my hand. The contact was brief but reassuring, a silent acknowledgement of the connection between us, despite the circumstances. "I'm sorry. I wish I could explain more." "I get it," I said, squeezing his hand before letting go. "Just be careful, okay?" "I will," he repeated, his eyes locking onto mine, filled with a mix of determination and something that looked a lot like regret. "I'll be back as soon as I can. We'll talk then." With that, he stood up and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I watched him go, a part of me wanting to follow, but I knew this was something he had to handle on his own. Still, the sudden turn of events left me feeling unsettled, like the ground beneath my feet had shifted. I tried to refocus on the conference, but my mind kept drifting back to Liam, wondering what he was facing and whether he was okay. The sessions that had once seemed so important now felt like background noise, distractions from the growing worry gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of my last session early, deciding to head back to the hotel and see if Liam had returned. As I walked through the lobby, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat when I saw a message from Liam. "Liam, can you meet me in the hotel bar?" I didn't waste a second, quickly making my way to the bar. When I arrived, I saw Liam sitting at a corner table, a drink in front of him, his posture tense. He looked up as I approached, and the relief in his eyes was palpable, but there was something else there too, something darker, more serious. "Liam, what's going on?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from him, my concern mounting. He didn't answer right away, taking a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down with a heavy sigh. "I wish I didn't have to drag you into this," he began, his voice low and strained. "But things have gotten more complicated than I expected." Complicated. How I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a situation with my research," he explained, choosing his words carefully. "Something that's come up unexpectedly, a breakthrough, but one that's put a lot of pressure on me. There are people involved who have their own agendas, and now I'm caught in the middle. My stomach twisted at his words. What does that mean for you? For us? Liam looked at me, his expression filled with a mix of frustration and helplessness. It means I have to be very careful about what I do next. There's more at stake than just my career, and I need to protect the people I care about. Liam. I began, but he cut me off. I want to keep seeing you, Max. I want to explore whatever this is between us. But I need you to understand that there might be times when I have to pull away, when I can't explain everything. It's not because I don't trust you, it's because I don't want to put you in harm's way. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the situation. I searched his face, trying to process everything he was telling me. This was far from what I'd imagined when we first collided in that airport, but now, here we were, faced with a reality that was much more complicated and dangerous than I'd anticipated. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. I understand, I said, my voice firm with resolve. I'm in this, Liam. I'm not going to run, just because things get tough. Relief washed over his face, and he reached out to take my hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. Thank you, Max. That means more to me than you know. We sat there for a moment, holding on to each other in the quiet of the bar, the gravity of the situation settling in. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. There were risks, unknowns, and challenges that neither of us could fully predict. But as I looked into Liam's eyes, I knew that I was ready to face them with him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of quiet conversation and shared silences, both of us aware that the road ahead would be anything but straightforward. But there was a comfort in knowing that we were in this together, that whatever challenges lay ahead, we wouldn't face them alone. And as we finally parted ways for the night, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The path ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, by Liam's side, ready to take on whatever came next.